Get comfortable. You know the drill by now. Lights down, headphones on, nowhere else you need to be for the next little while. Tonight isn't about the big cosmic machinery of Adventure Time, the crown and the comet, and the wish that started it all. You already know where that road goes if you've been here before. Tonight we're following smaller roads, quieter ones. The kind of decision that takes 4 seconds of screen time that nobody in the writer's room probably thought twice about, and that the show then spent years, sometimes literally years, of real broadcast time, letting unfold into something enormous. A test devised to catch a lazy security force. A boy born out of the side of his father's head because nobody wanted to say the real story out loud. A single piece of advice given to a grieving king about what to do with a baby who scared him. These are the threads we're pulling tonight, and I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll understand something about how this show actually worked, underneath all the jokes and the color. It never really believed in coincidence. It believed that everything, even the throwaway gags, had weight, and that weight had to go somewhere eventually. Think about your own life for a second before we go anywhere near ooh tonight. Think about the specific sentence someone said to you once in passing that you didn't understand the weight of until years later. Think about the ordinary Tuesday that turned out, only in retrospect, to be the hinge everything else swung on. Most of us live our whole lives without ever getting to see the shape of our own causation clearly, without ever getting the luxury of watching from the outside exactly how a small thing we said or did or failed to say kept quietly working itself out for a decade after we'd stopped thinking about it at all. That's part of what makes this show, of all shows, worth coming back to at an hour like this one. It gives you that outside view. It lets you watch, patiently, across years of its own runtime, exactly how the small things become the big things, so that maybe, afterward, you carry a little more of that patience back into your own life, where you'll never quite get to see the whole shape all at once. Let's start close to the ground with the smallest of these threads, because that's the right place to start when you're following something down. There's an episode from the show's 5th season, one of the odder structural experiments the writers ever tried, called simply Root Beer Guy. It doesn't feature Finn and Jake as heroes. It features them as the villains, or at least as the suspicious, shadowy figures at the center of somebody else's story, which is one of the more quietly radical choices Adventure Time ever made, handing its entire runtime over to a background character nobody had ever paid attention to before. Root Beer Guy is a citizen of the Candy Kingdom. He has a soda-colored head and a job he hates, cold calling strangers to sell them vitamin supplements, and at night he sits at a typewriter trying to write the detective novel that might finally make his life feel like it means something. His wife, Cherry Cream Soda, watches him drift further from her with each passing month, and there's a specific kind of sadness in the way the show draws their apartment, the lived-in clutter of 2 people who used to talk to each other and don't quite anymore. Nothing about this setup announces itself as important. It's the kind of scene that could belong to any story about any disappointed adult anywhere, and that's precisely the point. Adventure Time is telling you, gently, that this is a real life, lived at the edges of a much louder story, and that it deserves your attention exactly as much as Finn's does. Then one night, Root Beer Guy looks out of his window and sees Finn and Jake stuffing Princess Bubblegum into a chest. He tells his wife. She doesn't believe him. Nobody believes him. He goes to the Banana Guards, the Candy Kingdom's official security force, and they don't believe him either, because the Banana Guards in this show have never once given the impression of being especially competent at anything beyond standing in neat rows. So Root Beer Guy does the thing that people do when institutions fail them, and the truth feels too large to sit on alone. He starts investigating on his own. He tracks a purchase to a general store. He follows a trail through the woods to a lake. He watches from behind a bush as two figures he is now completely convinced are Finn and Jake throw what looks unmistakably like Princess Bubblegum into the water. And in a moment of genuine, if slightly absurd, heroism, he calls the Banana Guards and tells them that he is the one who kidnapped the princess, purely so they'll show up fast enough to catch the men he actually believes did it. Here's the reveal, and it's worth sitting with because of what it says about who's really in charge of this story underneath all its surface silliness. The entire kidnapping was staged. Princess Bubblegum orchestrated it herself, specifically to test whether her own security force was capable of noticing when their ruler had gone missing. They weren't. They failed completely, didn't even register her absence, and the person who actually solved the case, who tracked the evidence, who put together the true sequence of events through nothing but stubbornness and a hunger for meaning, was the telemarketer nobody believed. Bubblegum, to her credit, notices this immediately. She promotes Root Beer Guy on the spot, captain of the Banana Guard. And just like that, an ordinary man whose defining trait had been quiet disappointment becomes the person formally responsible for the safety of an entire kingdom because of a test he wasn't even supposed to pass, using detective instincts he'd only ever practiced on a typewriter nobody read. Notice, too, what the show chooses to spend its camera on in that moment of revelation. It doesn't linger on the Banana Guard's embarrassment, doesn't turn their incompetence into an extended joke, the way a lesser show might have milked it for another 2 or 3 minutes of screen time. It lingers on Root Beer Guy's face, the specific quality of disbelief settling into something else, something closer to a person realizing, for the first time in longer than he can probably remember, that his own mind is capable of being trusted. That's such a small thing to build an entire episode around, and it's exactly the kind of small thing this show never treated as small. This is where it would be easy for the story to end, a nice, tidy little parable about paying attention and being rewarded for it. But Adventure Time almost never lets things stay tidy once it's decided a character matters. Root Beer Guy appears afterward as Captain Root Beer Guy in later episodes, quietly present in crowd shots and background scenes, doing the job competently, the way background characters in this show tend to keep existing long after their spotlight episode has ended. And then, without fanfare, in the episode Something Big, he dies. Off screen. In an act of heroism, the show doesn't even bother to dramatize for us. The episode itself carries a dedication to his memory, which is a strange and quietly moving thing for a cartoon about a boy and his dog to do for a character who started as a joke about a bored telemarketer having a delusion. And then, because this is Adventure Time, and because this show has never once treated death as a hard stop the way most stories do, he comes back. In a later episode, he's resurrected, except not quite as himself. His head is no longer a mason jar of root beer. It's dirt now, packed soil with a cattail growing out of where his straw used to be, and he has plant-based abilities he never had before, and a new name that the fandom settled on almost immediately, Dirt Beer Guy. He manages the Candy Tavern after that. He shows up again, still recognizably himself underneath the transformation, in the later Fiona and Cake spin-off material, years and years after his original 10-minute episode aired. Think about the actual shape of that arc for a second, because it's worth holding in your hands before we move on. A background gag. A man standing in line at his workplace, barely noticed even by the animators who drew him into frame. One single afternoon where he refuses to let his own uncertainty stop him from investigating something he believed was true. A test he wasn't meant to be the hero of. A promotion. Years of quiet competence. A death that the show honored instead of shrugging off. A resurrection that changed the very substance of his body. None of it would exist if Princess Bubblegum hadn't needed, on one particular day, to know whether her guards were paying attention. That's the whole chain, start to finish, and it runs through an entire human life, or an entire candy person life, built from a single administrative decision that could just as easily have gone unmade. That's the shape we're tracing tonight. Small causes, enormous patient consequences. The show rarely tells you when it's setting one of these chains in motion. It just lets the moment happen, lets you laugh if it's funny, and then, sometimes years later in the show's actual runtime, shows you what grew out of it. It helps, I think, to remember exactly how unlikely all of this was to begin with, how easily any single one of these threads could have simply stayed a joke forever and never grown into anything more. Most cartoons, even good ones, let their background gags stay background gags. A silly test for a lazy security force resolves in a single episode and is never mentioned again. A strange detail about how a character was born gets quietly retconned or simply forgotten a season later once the writers move on to other ideas. A bite played for laughs stays exactly what it looked like, a joke about a bratty character being bratty, nothing more, forever. Adventure Time could have done any of that. Plenty of shows do, and there's no shame in it. That's simply how most ongoing television gets made, one episode at a time, without the luxury of knowing in advance which small detail might still matter a decade later. What makes this show different isn't that its writers were somehow smarter or more careful than everyone else's. It's that they were patient enough and trusting enough of their own instincts to let a strange detail simply sit there, unresolved for years, on the chance that it might eventually turn out to matter. Sometimes it didn't. Plenty of odd, throwaway details in this show never got a payoff at all, and that's fine too. Not every planted seed needs to grow into something, but often enough, more often than almost any other show I can think of, it did. There's a detail in the Root Beer Guy episode worth lingering on a little longer before we move past it, because it says something about how the show understood ripple effects even at the level of a single marriage. Cherry cream soda isn't drawn as a nagging wife or a punchline the way a lazier show might have used her. She's drawn as a woman who married someone hopeful and watched, slowly, over what the show implies has been a long stretch of ordinary years, as that hopefulness curdled into a kind of low-grade despair he didn't know how to talk about. She tells him, at one point, plainly, that she has needs, that she misses him even when he's sitting right across the table from her, and the show lets that land as a real complaint rather than comic relief. When Root Beer Guy finally solves his case and gets his promotion, the episode doesn't just give him professional purpose. It quietly repairs the marriage too, and it does it through the exact same mechanism. The small act of being taken seriously, of proving that your instincts about the world are worth trusting, turns out to heal more than one kind of relationship at once. That's the sort of layered consequence this show liked to bury inside episodes that looked, on the surface, like nothing more than a genre parody. If you're settling in for this one, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always like knowing that people carry these episodes into all kinds of different rooms, different countries, different hours of the night. It's a small thing, but it matters to me, and it fits the theme of tonight's video better than you might expect. Every comment is its own tiny cause, with its own small ripple, whether you know where it's going yet or not. Let's go a little further down, because there's a chain running underneath this whole show that most people don't think about until they've watched it several times, and it starts, as so many things in OO do, with something the writers clearly cooked up as a joke and then quietly decided to honor. It happened in the very first episode of the series, before any of the mythology had solidified, before anyone involved in making the show had any idea it would run for 10 seasons and become something as people talk about at 3 in the morning on YouTube. Finn and Jake are out at what the show calls Iceberg Lake, melting the ice with flamethrowers to find scrap material for a dock they're building, and Jake, complaining as usual about how hard the work is, melts through one particular iceberg and finds 4 men frozen inside it. Suits, briefcases, neckties, recognizably, unmistakably human, in a way absolutely nothing else in the show's world was, at that point, allowed to be. They call themselves the businessmen. They don't remember much beyond the fact that they were once in business. Finn and Jake, delighted by the free labor, hire them to finish the dock, and then, when the dock turns out beautifully, hire them full time. The businessmen take over more and more of the heroic workload, cleaning Finn's sword, packing his adventure bag, rescuing minor characters from minor peril, installing something called a hero vision monitor so Finn and Jake can watch for danger from the comfort of the couch. Finn and Jake, freed from responsibility, spend their days eating enormous quantities of ice cream and playing video games, and grow correspondingly lazy and round, which is one of those small, honest touches Adventure Time was always good at, showing you, without moralizing, what convenience actually does to a person over time. Eventually, the businessmen take their protective instincts too far, start sucking innocent bystanders into a giant vacuum contraption under the justification that this is simply the most efficient way to keep people safe, and Finn has to fire them, at which point they turn homicidal, and the whole thing ends in a fight, an explosion, and the businessmen willingly refreezing themselves and drifting back out into the lake to be forgotten again. There's a small, easy to miss detail earlier in that same episode, before the businessmen are even discovered, that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you exactly what kind of debris this show was always willing to let sit quietly in its background even before it understood what that debris meant. As Finn and Jake melt through the icebergs looking for scrap, before they find the four frozen men, they find other things first. A bicycle, several computers, a pile of baby shoes, all of them, strangely, for the left foot only. A detail the show never explains and never needs to, because the wrongness of it, the specific unsettling asymmetry of an entire cache of left shoes and no right ones, does more work sitting there silently than any explanation could have done. Jake complains about not finding any loot. Finn tells him to keep it together. Neither of them stops to wonder, even for a second, why an ordinary lake at the edge of their ordinary forest is full of frozen 21st century debris in the first place. They're children in a story that hasn't yet decided to become anything more than an adventure cartoon, and the show lets them stay children in that moment, innocent of the weight sitting all around them, the same way it would go on doing for years afterward, letting horror sit quietly in wide shots and background scenery while the foreground stayed bright and funny and safe. On its own, it's a silly 10-minute episode about the dangers of outsourcing your responsibilities. Nobody watching it in April of 2010 had any reason to think it mattered beyond that. But it planted something, quietly, permanently, into the bedrock of the show's world, something that the writers themselves have said in interviews they hadn't originally intended. These men were clearly, unmistakably remnants of something. A civilization that used briefcases and neckties and the specific vocabulary of corporate efficiency. A civilization that had been frozen, possibly killed, possibly transformed by something catastrophic enough to leave 4 ordinary office workers locked in ice at the bottom of a lake in a world otherwise made of candy and magic. Pendleton Ward has said, in retrospect, that this was the episode that made the show's post-apocalyptic backbone unavoidable. Once those 4 men existed in the show's canon, frozen and disoriented, and dressed for an office that no longer existed anywhere in the world, the entire rest of Adventure Time's mythology, the Mushroom War, the ruins, the mutated survivors, had to follow from that, logically, inevitably, because you cannot put businessmen in an iceberg and then simply not ask what happened to the world that made businessmen. That deeper history has been walked through plenty of times elsewhere, so we won't dwell on it again tonight, but it's worth naming once, cleanly, as the first domino, because everything else in tonight's video, everything downstream, exists inside the world that single joke accidentally built. Now, let's follow a thread that almost nobody talks about with the weight it deserves, because on the surface, it looks like nothing more than a birthday episode, a bit of silly lore about where Jake the dog actually came from. It's called Joshua and Margaret Investigations, and it aired deep into the show's run in its 6th season, long after audiences had already decided they understood exactly who Jake was and where he'd come from. The premise, as Jake tells it to Finn and BMO on his birthday, sounds at first like a cute framing device. Before Finn and Jake existed as we know them, their parents, Joshua and Margaret, were a monster-hunting detective duo straight out of a 1940s noir film, the kind of couple who speak in clipped, hard-boiled dialogue, who solve cases for money while heavily pregnant, who feed each other steaks and bicker about whether it's safe for a woman carrying a child to go chasing shapeshifters through the woods. The whole flashback is staged like something lifted directly out of an old black and white detective picture, and the show commits to that aesthetic completely, rather than treating it as a passing gag. Joshua and Margaret talk in clipped, rapid-fire dialogue, full of the specific vocabulary of a bygone era, calling each other sweetheart and dishing out lines that sound lifted from a 1940s radio serial. Their home has the cluttered, lived-in look of an office shared by 2 working partners rather than a domestic space, case files stacked beside dinner plates, a ticker tape machine spitting out potential jobs, the way an old newsroom teletype might have once spit out headlines. It's a strange, deliberately anachronistic texture for a show otherwise set 1,000 years after civilization collapsed, and that strangeness is exactly the point. Finn and Jake's actual parents existed inside a small, self-contained genre of their own, borrowed wholesale from a Hollywood era that had nothing to do with the post-apocalyptic present their sons would eventually grow up in, and the show never bothers explaining why that genre fits them so specifically. It simply lets it be true, the same unexplained, confident kind of true that so much of this show's best world-building relied on. Margaret is pregnant in this flashback with a baby the show will eventually reveal to be named Jermaine. Joshua is anxious about her safety in a way that comes across as controlling until you realize, watching it again, that it's really just fear dressed up as overprotectiveness, the specific fear of a man who has already decided he cannot survive losing the family he's building. They take on a case. Something has been stealing pies from tree trunks, an elephant who will go on to become one of the show's most beloved recurring characters, though at this point she's simply a client with a missing pastry problem. They solve it easily. It turns out to be her own husband. It's a light, comic little detour, the kind of scene the show uses to lull you before it pulls the floor out from under you. Because in the woods, tracking what they believe is the real threat, Joshua and Margaret are attacked by a shape-shifting creature, blue-skinned, six-eyed, capable of changing its form entirely. It bites Joshua on the head. The bite doesn't kill him, but it leaves behind a swelling, pulsing welt that grows and grows across the length of the episode, veins spreading visibly beneath his skin, while Margaret, heavily pregnant herself, goes off alone to hunt the creature down and extract its venom for an antidote, because that's simply who she is, the kind of person who refuses to let her own condition be treated as a limitation. And then, in one of the strangest and most quietly audacious scenes the show ever attempted, Margaret goes into labor with Germaine at the exact same moment that the welt on Joshua's head finally bursts. Two births happening in the same room in the same handful of seconds, one of them entirely ordinary and one of them anything but, and the show cuts between them with a kind of comic timing that almost lets you miss how strange the juxtaposition actually is until you stop and think about it afterward, lying here in the dark, the way we're doing right now. And out of it comes Jake, not born from Margaret, born from his father's skull, already able to speak, already able to sing a few bars and do a small dance before promptly passing out from the effort, in a scene the show plays for laughs, the same way it plays almost everything that would otherwise be unbearable for laughs, because comedy was always Adventure Time's preferred way of telling you something true without making you flinch away from it first. Jake is not Margaret's biological son. He never was. He is, genetically, the child of his father and an alien shape-shifting creature that bit him in the woods on the day his brother was born. Joshua and Margaret look at each other in the quiet after the chaos and make a decision together without much discussion, the kind of decision two people make instantly because some truths simply feel too strange and too dangerous to carry into daylight. They agree never to tell Jake how he was actually born, not when he's old enough to understand it, not ever. And they keep that promise all the way to their own deaths, which we know, from later material set after the main series, both eventually occurred. The secret went with them, permanently, into whatever afterlife this show's cosmology holds for magical dogs and their partners. Sit with that for a second, because it's a heavier thing than the episode's comic tone initially lets on. Jake spends the entire original run of Adventure Time not knowing what he actually is. Earlier in the show's run, in an episode called The Witch's Garden, Jake offers his own explanation for his stretchy powers. He believes, sincerely, that he got them from rolling around in a magic mud puddle as a puppy. It's presented as an innocent bit of character color at the time, the kind of half-remembered childhood myth people tell themselves about their own origins because nobody ever gave them the real answer. Princess Bubblegum, being a scientist, later offers her own competing theory in the episode Wizards Only Fools, suggesting that Jake's abilities are simply a mutation rather than anything magical, a theory that turns out, once Joshua and Margaret investigations finally airs, to be considerably closer to the truth than either of them realized, though still incomplete, because neither of them had any idea an interdimensional shapeshifter was involved. Think about how long the show actually let that mystery sit unresolved before finally answering it. Adventure Time premiered in 2010. The Witch's Garden, where Jake first offers his mud puddle explanation, aired in the show's very first season. Wizards Only Fools with Bubblegum's competing mutation theory, aired years later, well into the show's middle stretch. And Joshua and Margaret Investigations didn't air until the sixth season in the summer of 2014, which means the show let its own audience sit with an unanswered, half-joked about mystery about one of its two central characters for 4 full years of real broadcast time, before finally, casually, almost as an aside, inside a birthday-themed flashback episode, telling you the truth. 4 years is a strange amount of patience to ask of an audience, especially an audience that includes a great many young children who were probably not tracking the question with anything like the same intensity adult viewers eventually would. But that patience is exactly the show's signature. It never rushed its own reveals just because an audience might be waiting. It let the truth arrive precisely when the story needed it to arrive, and not one episode sooner. Jake carries an origin he doesn't know inside a body that quietly, visibly, carries the evidence of it anyway. His son, Jake Jr., is later shown with a face that unmistakably resembles the shape-shifting creature that fathered Jake, features passed down through a bloodline nobody in the family has ever fully acknowledged out loud. And there's a specific, quiet cruelty buried in Joshua and Margaret's decision, one the show never spells out in judgmental terms, but also never quite lets you forget. They didn't withhold the truth from Jake to protect him from something dangerous. There was no threat in the knowledge itself. They withheld it because the truth was strange, and strangeness in a family trying to look and feel ordinary can feel like its own kind of danger. Jake grew up loved completely, wanted completely, raised alongside a human boy his parents found abandoned and crying in the woods, and still, underneath all of that love, there was a gap where the truth should have been, a gap he never even knew was there to be curious about. There's a strange tenderness buried in the specific comedy of how Jake is actually born, if you let yourself sit with it instead of just laughing at the sight gag. He doesn't cry the way infants in this kind of story usually do. He sings. A few bars, a small dance, and then he collapses from the sheer effort of having just been born, already capable of performance, already, somehow, entertaining the room he's arrived in. It's easy to read that as nothing more than an absurdist flourish, a reference the show itself half acknowledges to the birth of Athena springing fully formed from the head of Zeus. But it also tells you something about the shape of Jake's whole character before he's even a minute old. He arrives in the world already trying to make the people around him feel good. That instinct isn't something he develops later through experience, through the slow accumulation of kindness that most characters need years to earn. It's there from the very first breath, coded into him alongside a heritage nobody in the room, least of all Jake himself, will ever fully understand. And Jermaine, born in the same handful of minutes, from Margaret rather than from a wound on his father's head, grows up carrying his own quiet weight from that day. The show touches on the relationship between the two brothers sparingly across its run, mostly in glimpses, but what comes through, even in fragments, is a specific kind of sibling tension that has nothing to do with jealousy over affection and everything to do with a gap neither of them can name. Germain is the biological son. Jake is the beloved one, the one Finn calls his brother without a second's hesitation, the one who becomes, functionally, the emotional center of the entire show's found family. There's no villainy in that dynamic, no resentment played for real drama, but there is a quiet asymmetry sitting underneath it that traces directly back to that single afternoon in the woods, to a bite that happened to one parent and not the other, to a birth that arrived through violence and transformation rather than through anything ordinary. Two brothers, born the same hour, carrying two entirely different origins, and only one of them ever finding out, decades later, just how different those origins actually were. It's worth pausing on the timing of all this too, because the show plants one more small detail in Joshua and Margaret investigations that connects it, almost invisibly, to another thread we're about to follow. As Joshua flips through the couple's ticker tape case files earlier in the episode, deciding which job is safest for his pregnant wife to take on, he reads off two cases he deliberately passes over. Something about a vampire girl in the grasslands, and something about a small fire goblin burning down the Candy Kingdom's forests. Marceline, Flame Princess. Both of them exist in this flashback as active threats already moving through the world on the exact same day that Jake is born. It's a blink and you'll miss it detail, easy to read as nothing more than a fun continuity wink for attentive fans. But it also tells you something the show rarely says directly. These characters' lives were always running in parallel, always overlapping in time. Even when their stories never touched, all of them shaped that same day by forces largely outside their control, all of them carrying secrets their families decided, for reasons that felt right at the time, not to tell them. Before we go all the way down to the deepest thread of tonight, it's worth pausing here, in the space between one chain and the next, to notice that Adventure Time occasionally has said all of this out loud, or close to it, in ways that had nothing to do with mythology or tragedy at all. There's a fourth season episode, one of the stranger structural experiments the writers ever attempted, called 5 Short Graybles, where a mysterious figure from what he calls the days of old, a man named Cuber, presents the audience with 5 completely unconnected little stories happening simultaneously across BMO talking to an imaginary friend in a bathroom mirror, Finn and Jake building toward the single greatest high five in the history of high fives, Princess Bubblegum assembling what she considers the perfect sandwich, the Ice King awkwardly bathing with the help of his penguins, and Lumpy Space Princess bombing, then somehow winning a talent show. On its surface, it's just a series of disconnected gags, 5 stories that never touch each other, happening in 5 different corners of the same afternoon. And then Kuber reveals, at the very end, that all 5 stories were connected the entire time by a single underlying theme, the 5 senses, sight and touch and taste and smell and hearing, threaded invisibly through moments that looked, while you were watching them, like nothing but coincidence. It's worth noting, too, that Root Beer Guy wasn't the only time this show reached for that same noir detective framing device to tell a story about someone the audience had never been trained to take seriously. An earlier episode called BMO Noir did something structurally similar, handing an entire episode over to BMO's interior life, letting the tiny game console imagine an entire hard-boiled detective mystery playing out inside the tree fort while Finn and Jake were simply out of the house. The show clearly liked this device. The small, overlooked character suddenly granted the full weight and gravity of a genre usually reserved for world-weary adults solving real crimes, because it let Adventure Time make its quiet argument about attention and significance twice in two different keys, using two characters who otherwise existed almost entirely at the margins of the show's main story. Neither BMO nor Root Beer Guy asked to be the center of anything. The show simply decided, on two separate occasions, that they deserved to be, if only for 11 minutes, and let the detective genre's borrowed sense of importance dignify a life the main plot would otherwise have walked straight past without a second glance. It's a small, almost throwaway structural joke, the kind of thing you could watch a dozen times without ever registering as meaningful. But it's also, if you squint even slightly, the clearest statement the show ever made about its own underlying belief system. Nothing that happens in OO happens in true isolation, even when it looks that way from the inside of any single scene. Every story is secretly touching every other story, connected by threads too fine to notice while you're standing inside any one of them, and it usually takes someone standing outside the moment entirely, someone with the patience and the distance to look at the whole shape of things at once, to see how it was all connected the entire time. The show gave us that idea wrapped in a joke about high fives and sandwiches, because that's how Adventure Time preferred to deliver its heaviest ideas, tucked inside something silly enough that you'd let your guard down before it landed. Which brings us to the deepest thread of tonight's descent, the one that took the show years, literal years of broadcast time across multiple seasons to fully unfold, and the one where a single piece of bad advice given once, quietly, off-screen, in the earliest days of a baby's life ends up reshaping an entire kingdom's fate. Her name is Phoebe. Most people know her as Flame Princess, and if you've watched this show even casually, you probably remember her as Finn's first real girlfriend, the fire elemental he fell for after his heart was broken by Princess Bubblegum, the relationship the show used to show Finn maturing, learning, failing, and trying again. But her story starts a long time before Finn ever meets her, and it starts with something genuinely upsetting when you actually sit with the mechanics of it. Phoebe was born into the Fire Kingdom already, from the moment of her birth, one of the most powerful beings in the entire land of Oo. Not eventually, not after some slow accumulation of strength through trial and hardship, the way most heroes in this kind of story earn their power. Immediately. As an infant, she was, we later learn, the fire elemental, one of a small handful of beings across the land who each embody an entire fundamental force, and her raw power, even as a newborn, was already greater than her own father's, the reigning Flame King. And her father was afraid of her. genuinely, viscerally afraid, the way people in positions of fragile authority tend to be afraid of anything that threatens to make that authority obsolete. According to the mythology the show lays out, he ordered a servant to take the infant Phoebe out into the wilderness and abandon her there, to let her perish quietly, where nobody would have to watch it happen or take responsibility for it. The servant couldn't do it. He gave her instead to a humble farmer to raise, and the show tells us, plainly, that even under this ordinary caretaking, Phoebe's elemental power kept escaping her control, burning through everything around her, an infant unable to help what she was, drawing dangerous attention toward the very kingdom her father had tried to erase her from. And this is where Princess Bubblegum enters the story, years before Finn ever falls in love with the girl this decision would eventually create. Bubblegum, recognizing the scale of the danger of fire elemental represented, and presumably believing she was doing the responsible thing, the scientific thing, the thing that would keep the greatest number of people safe, advised the Flame King to lock his own daughter away, not exile her again. Contain her. He built a lantern, a literal glass prison sitting in the main chamber of his own palace, and he sealed his infant daughter inside it. And there she stayed, not for a season, not for a handful of years, while things settled, for 14 years, an entire childhood, an entire adolescence spent inside a lamp, visible to everyone in the throne room, present for every audience and every court proceeding, and yet entirely, permanently, apart from the rest of the world, because the two most powerful adults in her life had decided, independently, that this was the safest way to manage what she was. Try to hold that image for a moment, the way the show eventually asks you to. A girl growing up, watching her father's kingdom function around her through glass, learning to speak, to think, to feel the entire enormous range of what a person feels, while every single one of those feelings was also, physically, dangerous, capable of scorching whatever surrounded her if she let them get too big. No friends her own age, no one to touch, obviously, given what she was made of. Just the slow architecture of years passing on the other side of a container built specifically to keep her separate from everyone who might otherwise have loved her plainly, without fear. Picture the specific texture of an afternoon inside that lamp, the kind of ordinary hour that most children spend running through grass, or arguing with a sibling, or falling asleep somewhere they weren't supposed to. Picture instead the curved glass wall of the container, the muffled sound of court business happening just beyond it, ministers and petitioners, and the ordinary business of a kingdom continuing exactly as it always had, indifferent to the girl watching all of it happen a few feet away, close enough to see every face clearly and far enough to never once be spoken to directly. Picture the particular loneliness of being visible and unreachable at the same time, present in every important room in the kingdom and untouched by every important relationship inside it. 14 years of that, long enough to go from infancy through the entire architecture of childhood and adolescence, long enough that whatever instincts a person develops for closeness, for trust, for the ordinary give and take of friendship, simply never got the chance to develop at all, because there was never anyone on the other side of the glass to develop them with. It's worth naming plainly, too, that nobody in this part of the story ever set out to be cruel for cruelty's sake. The servant, who couldn't bring himself to abandon an infant in the wilderness, was, in that single moment, more merciful than either of the two powerful adults who would go on to shape the rest of her childhood. The farmer who briefly took her in did so, presumably, out of simple decency, the ordinary decency of someone willing to feed and shelter a child who needed feeding and shelter, right up until her power outgrew what ordinary decency could safely contain. Even Bubblegum's advice, cold as it reads across the distance of years, was very likely offered as the responsible, careful, harm-reducing option available at the time. The kind of advice a brilliant scientist offers when she's looking at a problem and trying to minimize the greatest possible danger to the greatest possible number of people. The tragedy isn't that any single person along this chain was a monster. The tragedy is that responsible-sounding advice, offered once in good faith by someone with genuine authority, can still cost a child 14 years of her own life, and that nobody along the way ever stopped to ask whether there might have been a slower, harder, more patient way to keep everyone safe that didn't require locking a baby inside a lamp. She finally gets out, 14 years in, not because anyone reconsidered whether locking a child in a lamp had been the right call, but because her father needs something from her. Flambeau, a small fire elemental character who appears elsewhere in the show, is asked by Jake to find a Princess Finn's age to help mend his broken heart after his falling out with Bubblegum, and this sets in motion the Flame King's decision to finally release his daughter on the calculation that Finn, this human hero he's heard described in fearsome terms, might be exactly the kind of cold-blooded match his supposedly evil daughter deserves. He gets Finn's temperament backward almost entirely, but it doesn't matter because the mechanism works anyway. Phoebe is released into the world for the first time since infancy, meets Finn, and the show spends the following season and a half building one of its most quietly devastating relationships, precisely because everything about it is happening to a person who has never once been allowed to practice being ordinary. They fall for each other in the episode Burning Low, Finn willing to defy the literal physics of what she's made of just to be close to her, wrapping himself in tinfoil so they can hold each other without him catching fire. It's a strange image if you think about it too literally, and a devastatingly sincere one if you let it land the way it's meant to. Here is a boy trying, with the crudest tools available to him, to close a distance that an entire childhood was built around maintaining. Bubblegum, the same person whose advice put Phoebe in that lantern in the first place, is the one who warns Finn how dangerous this relationship actually is, how Phoebe's emotions, particularly the intense positive ones, could destabilize her power to the point of catastrophe. And there's something almost unbearably ironic in that warning coming from her specifically, a woman advising caution about a fire that she helped contain in the first place, speaking now as though she's simply a concerned outside observer rather than one of the two people who decided years earlier that the correct response to this girl's existence was isolation. The relationship eventually breaks, and it breaks because of exactly the kind of ordinary human failure that has nothing to do with elemental physics and everything to do with the fact that Finn, at this point in the show, is still a teenager figuring out how honesty works. He lies to her, tries to manufacture peace between her and the Ice King through deception rather than truth, and the deception detonates, quite literally. Phoebe, betrayed and furious, nearly destroys the Ice Kingdom and comes close to killing the Ice King himself before the situation is contained. Furious at Finn, at herself, at the entire unmanageable scale of what she's capable of when her feelings run too hot, she ends the relationship, and this is the moment where her story, instead of collapsing into tragedy, quietly turns a corner into something much more interesting. Rather than retreating back to the lamp, back to the shape her father and Bubblegum decided was safest for her, Phoebe goes to Bubblegum directly and asks for help learning to control her own power. And in working alongside the very person who once advised her imprisonment, she starts to uncover exactly what that history actually was. The servant's mercy, the farmer, the burning trail toward the Candy Kingdom, Bubblegum's original counsel to her father. She learns, piece by piece, precisely how she came to spend 14 years behind glass, and precisely whose voice had helped make that decision feel reasonable at the time. It reshapes everything. Rather than turning her fury solely toward her father, the more obvious villain of her own story, she now has to sit with the fact that the woman helping her learn control is also, in a very real sense, one of the architects of her original confinement. One more instance. If you followed this channel's other explorations of Bubblegum's long history of quietly consequential decisions made in the name of safety, of a pattern that runs through this entire kingdom's rulership. Protection administered as containment, care that arrives wearing the shape of control. Cinnamon Bun deserves a slower look here than the show usually gives him, because everything that makes his friendship with Phoebe matter comes from exactly what he isn't. He isn't clever in the way Bubblegum is clever. He isn't powerful in the way Phoebe herself is powerful, or even in the way most of the show's supporting cast eventually turns out to be powerful once their own hidden history gets revealed. He's gentle, a little scattered, easily overwhelmed, the kind of character other characters in the show routinely underestimate and occasionally outright mock. And that's precisely what makes him safe, in a way almost nobody else in Phoebe's life had ever been. He doesn't want anything from her power. He isn't afraid of it the way her father was, doesn't need to manage it the way Bubblegum does, doesn't need her to be anything other than exactly what she already is in any given moment. There's a kind of friendship that only becomes possible once every other kind of relationship in your life has taught you to expect an agenda, and Cinnamon Bun, almost by accident, by virtue of simply being too guileless to have one, becomes the first person in Phoebe's entire existence who loves her without asking anything of her fire in return. That's not nothing. In fact, tracing the chain all the way through, it might be the single most important link in the whole thing, because without that particular friendship, without a companion this unthreatening and this undemanding standing beside her, it's genuinely hard to imagine Phoebe finding the steadiness to walk back into her father's palace and take the throne rather than simply burning the whole place down out of the entirely understandable rage 14 years in a lamp would leave anyone carrying. Cinnamon Bun becomes her knight, later, formally, in the show's own language, and there's something quietly moving in the idea that the person who ends up standing at a queen's side through her hardest hour was never chosen for strength or cleverness or strategic value at all. He was chosen simply because he was kind, and because kindness, uncomplicated and undemanding, was the one thing nobody had ever offered her before. And here's where the chain does something genuinely remarkable, something that elevates this story past a simple parable about childhood neglect. Phoebe doesn't collapse under any of this. She doesn't spend the rest of her life defined only by what was taken from her, doesn't let 14 years behind glass become the whole shape of who she's allowed to become afterward, and that refusal, quiet and unannounced as it is, might be the single bravest thing anyone does across this entire chain of consequence. She befriends Cinnamon Bun, a character the show had spent seasons treating as comic relief, gentle, a little foolish, easily overlooked, and finds in that friendship something none of the more obviously significant relationships in her life had offered her. Simple, undemanding companionship, someone who wants nothing from her power and asks for nothing but her presence. With Cinnamon Bun at her side, she goes home, not as a returning prisoner, as someone reclaiming what was always rightfully hers. She confronts her father, the man who tried to have her abandoned as an infant and then imprisoned her for 14 years once abandonment failed, and she overthrows him, sealing him in the exact same lantern he once sealed her inside, a piece of narrative symmetry so precise it feels almost mathematical. The container built for containment becomes the container for the man who built it. There's a scene that comes later, once she's already queen, that quietly closes the loop on everything Bubblegum set in motion all those years earlier, and it's worth walking through slowly because of how much history is compressed into it. Phoebe, trying to rebuild what's left of the Fire Kingdom's strength, is approached by Bubblegum with an offer of alliance, framed as help, framed the way Bubblegum's offers of help so often are, as something generous and neighborly. They sing together, at one point, a song called A Kingdom from a Spark, about building something new out of almost nothing, and it's genuinely sweet on its surface, two rulers finding common ground. But underneath the song, Bubblegum is quietly siphoning temperature control units from Phoebe's fire giants, disarming them piece by piece without her knowledge, the exact same instinct that put Phoebe in a lantern in the first place, dressed up now in the language of cooperation instead of protection. Phoebe catches her in the act. Bubblegum lies about it, claims the unit simply fell out of her bag, and for a moment it almost works, until her bag rips further and the truth spills out along with the rest of the stolen equipment. The fight that follows destroys nearly all of Phoebe's fire giants, and Bubblegum, exhausted, guilty in the specific quiet way she gets guilty, promises to leave her the one remaining giant, hoping it might be enough to repair what her instinct toward control had just cost her. It's the same pattern playing out again, years after the lantern, in a different key, with different stakes, and Phoebe, older now, sees it clearly for exactly what it is in a way the infant behind the glass never could have. She finds her real footing, in the end, somewhere quieter than any of that political maneuvering. She takes up rap as an outlet, working through her feelings about her father, about the years behind glass, about the whole shape of what was done to her, turning all of it into something she can perform rather than simply carry. When a rival calling himself Don John tries to turn her own citizens against her, appealing to exactly the kind of fear and instability her father once used to justify locking her away, she doesn't answer it with force. She answers it by being, visibly, consistently, a different kind of ruler than the one her people had known before her, patient where he was cruel, present where he was distant, honest where he built his entire reign on justified concealment. She rules differently than he ever did. The show is careful about this, careful not to let her simply become a mirror image of her father's cruelty, now wearing a crown instead of wielding one. She's shown listening to her citizens, addressing their problems directly, working to build something genuinely better than what she inherited, taking the time, in ways her father never once bothered to actually walk among the people she governs, rather than simply issuing decisions from behind a wall of advisors and second-hand reports. And in one of the more surprising turns her story eventually takes, she processes what happened to her not through vengeance, but through art. Taking up rap as a means of working through her feelings about her father, her imprisonment, and the entire architecture of harm she was born into. When Don John, a rival flame lord, attempts to sway her people against her, and even when a confrontation with Bubblegum over stolen weapons very nearly reignites the entire cycle of distrust between the fire and candy kingdoms, Phoebe steps back from the brink rather than letting the fire in her consume the moment the way it once nearly consumed the Ice Kingdom. And when her father eventually escapes his own lantern, the show gives her something better than simple triumph. It gives her restraint. Rather than hunting him down, she lets him go, lets him try to define himself somewhere outside the walls that shaped both of their lives, the exact mercy nobody ever extended to her. Follow that whole chain back to its beginning, all the way back, and here's what you find waiting at the root of it. A newborn baby, more powerful than the adults around her understood how to handle. A father too afraid to simply learn to parent something unfamiliar. A single piece of advice, offered once, probably in a spirit of genuine caution, by a princess who has spent her whole reign believing that careful, calculated control is the safest way to manage anything dangerous. That single piece of advice becomes 14 years inside a lamp. 14 years inside a lamp becomes a girl who doesn't know how to be ordinary. That unfamiliarity with ordinariness becomes a relationship built on secrecy and eventually broken by a lie. That broken relationship becomes an act of self-education, seeking out the very woman who once counseled her containment. That self-education becomes the discovery of the truth she was never told. That discovery becomes a friendship the show had spent years training you not to take seriously. That friendship becomes the courage to go home. Going home becomes a revolution. The revolution becomes a rulership defined, deliberately, by everything her father's rulership was not. And the entire chain, every link of it, traces back to a sentence spoken once, quietly, in a moment the show never even bothers to show us directly, between two adults trying to decide what to do about a baby who frightened them. That's the real shape of causation in this show, if you sit with it long enough. It rarely announces itself as important in the moment. It just happens, quietly, and then the show, patient in a way in almost no other animated series aimed at children has ever bothered to be, lets you watch what it becomes, sometimes across a single episode, sometimes across the better part of a decade of episodes, until the small original cause is nearly impossible to see anymore underneath everything that grew on top of it. There's one more thread worth following before we start climbing back up out of tonight's descent, and it might be the longest fuse this entire show ever lit, because it runs quietly, invisibly, from the very first season all the way to the ninth, longer than almost any other chain of consequence the writers ever attempted. And for most of that stretch, it doesn't look like a chain at all. It looks like a single, forgettable gag. Early in the show's run, in an episode called Trouble in Lumpy Space Princess, in one of her usual fits of dramatic irritation, bites Jake. It's played entirely for laughs, a small, bratty act of aggression from a character the show has spent that same episode establishing as spoiled, sarcastic, and endlessly self-absorbed. Nothing about the bite is treated as significant in the moment. It's a joke about her being annoying, nothing more, the kind of beat that exists purely to remind you what kind of person she is, before the plot moves on to whatever Finn and Jake actually need to accomplish that day. It takes the show 8 more seasons to tell you why that bite mattered. In the miniseries called Elements, which aired near the very end of the show's run, Ooh is transformed into something almost unrecognizable, torn apart by 4 elemental forces running out of control: candy, ice, fire, and slime, each one turning the people caught inside its territory into distorted, exaggerated versions of themselves. Finn and Jake spend the miniseries traveling through each corrupted kingdom, trying to gather the pieces needed to reverse the damage, and Jake himself gets absorbed into the chaos along the way, pulled into the Slime Kingdom's transformation until he emerges looking, disturbingly, like his actual biological father, the shape-shifting creature from the woods. His true shape finally visible on the outside for the first time in the show's entire run, though Jake himself never seems to fully register what he's looking at when Finn sees it. And it's Lumpy Space Princess, of all people, the character the show spent its first season using purely as comic relief, who turns out to be the only being capable of fixing any of it. She is revealed in the episode Skyhooks 2 to be an elemental herself, just like Bubblegum and Phoebe and the Ice King's own long mythology, except hers isn't one of the 4 visible elements. She is the anti-elemental, the 5th force, the one that exists specifically to undo what the other 4 do when they spiral out of control, the subspace lattice, as the show puts it, that binds the scientific and the magical back into their proper shape. And here's the detail that ties the whole thing back to that forgotten bite 8 seasons earlier. Lumpy space people transform others into their own kind through biting, the exact same mechanism the show showed you as a throwaway joke in its very first season, without ever telling you it was mechanically identical to the cosmic power that would eventually help save the entire world. Lumpy Space Princess herself barely understands any of this when the moment finally arrives. She admits, plainly, that she never paid attention to her own parents' lectures about what her kind actually were, tuned it all out the way a bored teenager tunes out anything that sounds like homework, and now finds her both standing at the center of a crisis that requires exactly the knowledge she spent her whole childhood ignoring. She figures it out anyway, in the moment, the way she's always figured everything out, through sheer stubborn instinct rather than preparation, and she reaches into the wreckage of Ooh and pulls it back into its true shape, restoring the transformed citizens, regrowing a broken horn on a young character named Sweet Pea, undoing, in one sweeping act, the damage of the entire miniseries. Except it doesn't undo everything. Jake stays in his true form afterward, 5 eyes, the unmistakable resemblance to the creature that fathered him, visible now for anyone paying attention, though the show leaves it deliberately, quietly ambiguous whether Jake himself ever fully registers what happened to his own face. Finn looks at him, in the show's own words, and simply promises they'll find a way to fix it, no matter what, and Jake laughs it off nervously, the same easy warmth he's always carried, seemingly unaware that his own body is now telling a story his parents spent a lifetime trying to keep untold. Follow that thread all the way back, the way we've been doing all night. A single bite treated as a punchline in a season 1 episode about a spoiled princess having a tantrum. 8 seasons of silence. 8 seasons where nobody watching, not even the most devoted fans combing through the show for clues, had any particular reason to suspect that a moment played so purely for comedy was quietly load-bearing the entire time. And then, right when the entire world needed saving, that same joke turns out to have been carrying the actual mechanism of the story's resolution the entire time, buried in plain sight, waiting for the exact right moment to matter. Adventure Time did this more than almost any other show I can think of. It planted its answers years before it asked the questions, and then entrusted you, completely, without a single reminder along the way, to still be paying attention by the time the payoff finally arrived. There's something worth naming plainly here, because Adventure Time was always more honest about this than it needed to be for a show ostensibly aimed at children. None of the people making these decisions, not Joshua and Margaret keeping Jake's origin secret, not the Flame King trying to protect his own throne, not even Princess Bubblegum offering the advice that led to a lamp, were acting out of simple cruelty. Every single one of them believed in the moment that they were choosing the safer path, the more responsible path, the path that would cause the least harm to the largest number of people. Joshua and Margaret genuinely believed silence would spare Jake confusion and pain. The Flame King, whatever else you want to say about him, was reacting out of a real fear that his infant daughter could one day destroy everything he'd built, a fear that turned out, eventually to be at least partly justified, since she did in fact eventually take his throne from him. And Bubblegum, whatever pattern of controlling behavior her long reign eventually reveals across so many separate incidents, has never once been shown enjoying the harm that pattern causes. She simply, consistently, chooses containment over trust, management over honesty, and the show, patient as ever, lets you watch what that choice costs, episode after episode, kingdom after kingdom, without ever needing to stand up and announce the lesson out loud. That's what makes these chains so much harder to look away from than a simple morality tale would be. Nobody in Adventure Time gets to be the villain in the way villains usually work in stories built for children. The Flame King is afraid, and his fear does real harm, and the show still, eventually, lets him walk free into the wilderness rather than punishing him further, because Phoebe herself chooses mercy over the neat satisfaction of seeing him suffer. Joshua and Margaret's silence is never framed as malicious, only as the ordinary, understandable cowardice of two people who love their son enough to worry that the whole truth might somehow diminish that love, when in fact it never would have. And Bubblegum, brilliant and lonely and endlessly capable, keeps making the same essential mistake across kingdom after kingdom, generation after generation, because the show understands something true about people who have real power. The impulse to protect and the impulse to control very often wear the exact same clothes, and it takes a very long time, sometimes an entire childhood spent inside a lamp, for anyone to notice the difference. It's worth sitting, too, with how consistent this specific failure mode is across Bubblegum's entire reign, even without walking back through every single instance of it in detail tonight, since some of those instances have already had their own full night here on this channel. The shape keeps repeating itself with an almost mathematical regularity. She encounters something unfamiliar, something whose behavior she cannot yet predict with the confidence her scientific mind demands, and rather than sitting with that uncertainty, rather than allowing herself the slower, harder, more vulnerable work of learning to trust something she doesn't yet fully understand, she reaches instead for containment. A lantern for an infant fire elemental, a locked door for a piece of knowledge she's decided her people aren't ready to hold, a carefully managed narrative for a threat she'd rather handle quietly than explain honestly. It isn't cruelty driving any of it, not once, not in any single instance across her long rule. It's something closer to a very specific kind of fear, disguised even to herself as responsibility, the fear of a brilliant mind confronted with something it cannot fully model, and the quiet, understandable, deeply human impulse to solve that discomfort by simply removing the unpredictable thing from view, rather than sitting with it long enough to actually understand it. Phoebe's story is one of the clearest places the show ever let you watch the actual cost of that impulse play out to its full conclusion, because unlike some of Bubblegum's other choices, this one comes with a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can trace start to finish across a single character's entire arc. You get the fear, you get the containment, you get the years it costs. And then Because Adventure Time was always more interested in growth than in simple accountability. You get the slow, difficult, only partially successful process of two people trying to build something honest together after the damage was already done. Phoebe learning control, not because she was ever taught to trust herself, but because she finally had someone patient enough to practice alongside, and Bubblegum, in her own quiet way, having to sit across from the living, breathing consequence of her own advice and reckon with it directly, instead of at the comfortable remove of a policy decision made years earlier about someone she'd never had to actually look in the eye. Think for a moment about what it would have looked like if any single person along these chains had simply chosen differently at the one moment that actually mattered. If the Flame King, holding his newborn daughter for the first time, had felt something other than fear, looking at how much power was already awake behind her eyes. If Joshua, sitting with Margaret in the quiet aftermath of that impossible birth, had said simply, "We'll tell him when he's old enough to understand," rather than deciding the truth was too strange to ever be safe. If Bubblegum, watching an infant elemental burn through everything a farmer owned, had reached instead for patience, for the slower and harder work of teaching control, rather than the quicker, colder solution of a locked container. None of those alternate choices would have made for a worse show, necessarily. They might have made for a kinder world, but they wouldn't have been true to what Adventure Time actually believed about people, which is that fear very rarely announces itself as fear in the moment it's making a decision. It shows up wearing the sensible, responsible, well-intentioned clothes of caution, and it takes years, sometimes a decade of consequences working themselves out in full view of an audience willing to stay patient before anyone can see clearly enough to name what really happened. That's not a cynical observation, even though it might sound like one laid out plainly like this in the dark. It's closer to something forgiving. The show never asks you to hate the Flame King, or to feel contempt for Joshua and Margaret, or to write Bubblegum off as some cold, calculating monarch incapable of growth. It asks you to recognize the particular, ordinary human shape of getting something wrong for reasons that felt right at the time, and then it asks you to watch what happens next, patiently, because what happens next is where the real meaning of the story actually lives. What strikes me most, thinking about all three of these threads laid out together, side by side, the way we've walked through them tonight, is how differently each one resolves, even though they all begin from the same basic shape. An adult making a decision on behalf of someone too young or too powerless to have them an say in it. Root Beer Guy's chain resolves in something almost purely generous, a man given, by pure accident, exactly the kind of significance he'd spent his whole life quietly aching for, and the show letting him keep that significance even past his own death. Jake's chain resolves in something more bittersweet, a life lived fully and joyfully and lovingly, but built permanently on top of a gap where the truth should have been, a gap that closes for the audience long before it ever closes, if it ever does, for Jake himself. And Phoebe's chain resolves in something closer to genuine triumph, a girl who takes the exact tools that were used to contain her and uses them instead to build something better than what came before, though it takes 14 years of imprisonment and a broken relationship and a painful reckoning with the truth to get her there. None of these outcomes were inevitable. That's the part worth sitting with in the dark tonight. Root Beer Guy could have simply gone home and never called the banana guards, could have let the fear of not being believed win out over the strange dignity of pursuing something he knew deep down to be true. Jake could have grown up in a slightly different household with parents slightly less certain that silence was kindness, and might have spent his whole life understanding exactly what he was, instead of carrying an unknown shape quietly inside a body that never fully explained itself to him. And Phoebe, more than either of the others, could very easily have never made it out of that lamp changed rather than broken. There's nothing in the mechanics of the story that guaranteed she would come out of 14 years of isolation still capable of choosing friendship, still capable of choosing mercy for the very father who tried twice to be rid of her. The show gives her that outcome, but it never once pretends the outcome was owed to her. It was earned, slowly, painfully, through choices she made herself once she was finally free enough to make any. That, I think, might be the real argument buried underneath all of Adventure Time's willingness to track these small causes across such enormous stretches of time. The show clearly believes that where you start doesn't get to decide, on its own, where you end up. The businessman frozen in an iceberg accidentally built an entire post-apocalyptic mythology, but that mythology became a world capable of holding kindness as easily as ruin. A single administrative test built to catch a lazy security force accidentally built an entire life for a man who never expected one, a life that continued to matter even after his death. A shapeshifter's bite in the woods, kept secret for a lifetime, still produced a creature as generous and as easy to love as Jake the dog, secret gap and all. And a single flawed piece of advice, offered once by someone who genuinely believed she was choosing the safest path, produced 14 years of real and unnecessary suffering, and then, somehow, on the other side of all that suffering, produced a queen who chose to rule by exactly the opposite instinct that shaped her own childhood. Causes don't disappear once they've happened. That's the quiet, patient argument this show keeps making over and over in different keys across nearly every corner of its world if you're willing to look closely enough. They just keep moving, mostly invisibly, underneath everything that comes after them, the way water keeps moving underneath ice, even when the surface looks perfectly still. You can melt an iceberg looking for scrap material for a dock and find, instead, the opening chapter of an entire civilization's afterlife. You can devise a simple test for a security force and accidentally give a stranger's whole life its shape. You can offer one sentence of advice about a frightened infant and set in motion 14 years that will eventually produce a queen wise enough not to repeat your mistake. Nothing in the land of Ooh happens by itself. Nothing in it happens only once, either. Not really. Every choice keeps happening, quietly, in everything that follows from it, for as long as the story keeps being told. That's not a comforting thought exactly, not entirely, because it means the careless choices keep happening too, keep costing what they cost, long after anyone remembers making them. But it isn't a bleak thought either, because it means the good choices keep happening as well, keep paying out their quiet interest, long after the person who made them has stopped thinking about it, maybe long after they're gone entirely. Root Beer Guy is still, in some small sense, catching things other people miss every single time someone rewatches that strange little noir episode and takes his instincts seriously instead of laughing them off. Jake is still, in some small sense, carrying an unknown origin gently, without letting it curdle into bitterness, every time the show cuts to him doing something warm and unself-conscious and entirely himself. And Phoebe is still, in some small sense, choosing mercy over vengeance every single time an episode plays, where she lets her father walk free instead of making him pay for what he did to her. That's the shape of a butterfly effect that actually means something, I think, more than the purely mechanical kind, the kind where one flap of a wing supposedly reroutes a hurricane on the other side of the world. It isn't just that small things cause but big things, though they clearly do, over and over, in this show and everywhere else. It's that the small things never really finish happening. They keep happening, quietly, underneath everything that follows, for as long as anyone is still watching, still listening, still willing to trace the thread all the way back down to where it started. Picture all four of these threads laid out side by side, the way you might lay out four separate photographs on a table in a dim room, each one taken at a completely different moment in the show's 10-year run, none of them appearing to belong to the same story at all. A telemarketer crouched behind a bush at a lake, wearing a cheap suit, convinced he's witnessing a kidnapping. A man's skull swelling with something that will, within the hour, sing and dance, and then collapse asleep on the floor of a 1940s style detective office. An infant, more powerful than her own father, being carried out into the wilderness by a servant who can't go through with it. A princess in lumpy purple form, biting a magical dog out of nothing more than irritation, in an episode where nobody, not even the writers themselves at the time, had any idea that gesture was rehearsing the literal mechanism that would one day save the world. 4 photographs. 4 completely different rooms, different years, different characters who barely, if ever, share a scene together across the entire show's run. And yet lay them out together like this, in the dark, the way we've done tonight, and you start to see the same handwriting underneath every single one of them. Something small happens. Nobody in the room understands yet what it's going to become. And the show simply waits, patient as a held breath, until it's ready to show you. That patience is, I'd argue, the actual through line connecting everything Adventure Time ever did well. It's there in the big cosmic mythology, the crown and the wish and the war that ended the old world. The kind of ground plenty of other explorations of this show, including some of the ones on this very channel, have already walked you through in detail. But it's just as present, maybe even more quietly moving, in these smaller, less mythologically loaded corners. A background character's marriage, a secret two parents decided to carry to their graves, a sentence of advice about a frightened baby, a bite played for laughs. The show never distinguished between the two registers in terms of how seriously it treated them. Every consequence got the same patient attention eventually, whether it came wrapped in cosmic language about entities older than the universe, or in the considerably more modest language of a telemarketer finally getting a promotion he never expected. There's a particular kind of viewer this show seemed to have in mind from very early on, even if nobody making it could have said so directly at the time, and it's worth describing that viewer for a moment before we move any further. Not a child watching once, laughing at the jokes and moving on to the next program. Someone willing to come back. Someone willing to sit with an episode a second time, a third time, years apart sometimes, and notice on each return trip some small detail that had simply been invisible the first time through, because the first time through you didn't yet know what it was going to become. That's a strange kind of trust to place in an audience that included, by any measure, a great many actual children too young to be rewatching anything with that kind of deliberate patience. But the show placed that trust in anyway, built its foundations for the version of the audience that would eventually grow into exactly that kind of viewer, the kind sitting here right now, in whatever room this has found you in, willing to spend this many minutes tonight, following threads most people never bother tracing all the way back to where they started. That's a specific gift, when you think about it, the gift of being made for someone you'll eventually become, rather than only for who you already are. Adventure Time gave that gift to an enormous number of people who were far too young when the show first aired to fully receive it. It simply waited, the same way it waited to tell you what Jake actually was, the same way it waited 8 seasons to explain a bite, confident that the people watching would eventually catch up to what it had already quietly built for them. There's a specific kind of scene Adventure Time returned to again and again across its run, one that's easy to overlook precisely because it happens so quietly, and it's worth naming before we climb the rest of the way back up into the ordinary night. It's the scene of the cause you never actually get to see. The show loved withholding the moment itself, the actual instant where a decision got made, and giving you instead only the consequence, sometimes years later, sometimes an entire season later, forcing you to reconstruct the missing scene out of nothing but its aftermath. We never see the servant handing an infant Phoebe to a farmer. We never see the exact words Bubblegum used when she advised the Flame King toward a lantern instead of patience. We never see Joshua and Margaret's actual conversation about whether to tell Jake the truth someday, only the single line delivered so casually it's almost thrown away that they simply never did. The show trusted you to feel the weight of an event. It refused to dramatize, to sit with the gap where a pivotal scene should have been and let your own imagination fill in exactly how quiet, how ordinary, how devastatingly undramatic that missing moment probably was. That's a strange kind of storytelling discipline for a network cartoon to practice, and I think it's part of why these threads land the way they do, even now, even on however many rewatches you've given this show over however many years. Most stories give you the big decision in full, lit dramatically, scored appropriately, framed so you understand in the moment that this is the scene that matters. Adventure Time kept doing the opposite. It let its biggest decisions happen off screen, in the space between episodes, in the space between seasons sometimes, and it only ever showed you the receipts afterward. A lamp sitting in a throne room nobody explains until years later, a birthday story, a grown dog tells his best friend without ever quite finishing it, a promotion handed to a telemarketer with no fanfare at all beyond the simple fact that he'd earned it. The causes stayed invisible, only the consequences ever got the camera's full attention, and somehow, counterintuitively, that made the causes feel heavier once you finally understood them, not lighter, the way a sound you can't quite place is always louder in memory than a sound you saw coming. There's something almost architectural about the way this show was built, if you think about it in those terms. Most television, even good television, is built the way a house is built, room by room, season by season, with load-bearing walls that hold up only the story directly above them. Adventure Time was built more like a coral reef, or maybe more like the actual candy geology of its own world, layer accreting on top of layer over years and years, until the earliest, thinnest layers were buried so deep beneath everything that came after that, you'd need a reason to go looking for them at all. And yet the show never let those buried layers stop mattering. It kept reaching back down into its own foundation, season after season, and pulling load-bearing meaning out of things that had, at the time they were made, no weight-bearing purpose whatsoever. A joke about a talent show, a joke about an annoying princess biting someone, a joke about businessmen who can't remember their own names. None of it was built to hold anything up. All of it, eventually, held something up anyway. I think that's part of why this particular show still finds people at 3 a.m, still finds them in the specific quiet of a headphone-lit room long after the rest of the world outside their window has gone dark. It isn't just nostalgia, though nostalgia is certainly part of it. The pull of a theme song recorded imperfectly in a cramped studio, a ukulele and a voice and the faint sound of someone typing that the creator loved too much to ever edit out. It's something closer to recognition. Most of us carry around exactly this kind of architecture in our own lives without ever being handed the tools to see it clearly. A sentence someone said to us once, offhand, when we were 7 years old, that we didn't understand the weight of until we were 30. A small kindness a stranger showed us on an ordinary Tuesday that quietly rerouted the rest of our decade. A fear our own parents carried, dressed up as a rule, that we spent years mistaking for simple discipline before we finally understood what it actually was. Adventure Time gave all of that a shape, a language, a way of being looked at directly, without flinching, wrapped in candy colors and post-apocalyptic ruins, and a boy in a white hat who never stopped being decent, even once he understood exactly how much had been lost to get him here. Root beer guy didn't know, sitting at his typewriter on an ordinary night, that the story he was writing about a detective named Joe Milkshake was actually rehearsing him for the real investigation that would define the rest of his life, the same way none of us ever quite know while we're living through an apparently ordinary evening, which evening is secretly the one that matters most. Jake never got to know, not once, not even at the very end, exactly what he actually was, and somehow that gap never once made him less himself, never once made the warmth he offered and everyone around him feel smaller or more conditional. And Phoebe, more than either of them, had to learn the hardest version of this lesson there is, that the people who shape us most permanently are very rarely acting out of malice, that the same hand which locks you away can, years later, still be trying, imperfectly, to help you learn to control the very thing it once decided was too dangerous to let loose, and that healing sometimes means sitting with both of those truths at once without asking either one to cancel the other out. None of these three chains touch each other directly, not in any way the show ever draws an explicit line between. Root Beer Guy never meets Phoebe. Jake's secret origin has nothing mechanically to do with a bite in a season 1 episode about a talent show, or with a lamp in a fire palace, or with a test devised to catch a lazy security force. But they were all built by the same patient hand, the same writer's room willing to plant something small and trust it to matter later, sometimes years later, sometimes so many years later, that most of the audience had long since stopped expecting the payoff to ever arrive. That patience is, I think, the actual subject of tonight's video, more than any single one of the chains themselves. Adventure Time believed, all the way down to its bones, that nothing gets to just be a joke forever. Everything eventually has to mean something, whether the world is ready for that meaning or not. I think that's a good place to rest for tonight. We've gone from a lonely telemarketer with a typewriter to a boy born out of a secret nobody ever told him, to a girl who spent 14 years learning what it feels like to be loved through glass, to a bite that took 8 seasons to matter, and at the bottom of all 4 of those roads is the same simple, patient truth. This show kept returning to, season after season, in ways loud and quiet alike. Nothing that happens here happens in isolation, and nothing that happens here, however small it looks in the moment, ever really finishes happening. The candy is still real. The consequences are still real too. They were always the same substance all along, just moving at different speeds. Somewhere tonight, wherever you actually are, whatever room this is finding you in, there's probably some small thread of your own still quietly working itself out. Something you said or didn't say. Some kindness you offered without thinking twice about it. Some decision made on your behalf a long time ago by someone who loved you and got it wrong anyway. You don't have to know exactly what it is right now, lying here in the dark, and you probably won't. Not tonight, maybe not for years. Most people never get the luxury of knowing clearly, not the way we got to know it tonight, for Root Beer Guy, for Jake, for Phoebe, for a princess who never listened to her own parents' lectures until the one day the whole world needed her to. But it's there, moving underneath everything, the way it always is, the way this show insisted it always is, patient and quiet and completely unconcerned with whether you're paying attention. Someday, maybe, you'll get your own version of the reveal. Until then, You can just rest and let it keep moving the way the land of Ooh lets its own history keep moving underneath the candy and the color, whether anyone's watching closely enough to notice or not. Even that comment you left in earlier tonight, telling me where you are and what time it is where you're lying, is its own small cause, moving out into a chain you can't fully see the end of yet. Somebody else might scroll past it tomorrow, half awake in a different country, a different hour, and feel a little less alone for a second, knowing someone else out there was doing exactly the same thing they're doing now, listening to the same voice in the same kind of dark. That's a small thing. It's also, if tonight's video has done its job at all, exactly the kind of small thing this whole story has been about. You never really get to see where your own threads end up. You just get to trust, the way Root Beer Guy eventually learned to trust his own instincts, the way Phoebe eventually learned to trust a friendship that asked nothing of her, that the small thing you did tonight was worth doing anyway. There's a version of all this that extends even past the show itself, if you're willing to follow the thread one layer further than the episodes themselves ever explicitly go. The rioters' room that built Adventure Time went on, after the show ended, to seed an entire generation of animation with people who learned, inside this exact production, that a children's cartoon could hold real weight without ever once losing its lightness. That's its own kind of butterfly effect, arguably the largest one of all, bigger than any single character's arc, bigger even than the show's own decade-long mythology, a small, strange pitch about a boy and his dog sung on a ukulele in a room where you can still hear someone typing in the background, quietly reshaping what an entire industry believed animated storytelling was allowed to attempt. Nobody in that original pitch meeting could have known that. They were just trying to get a 7-minute short made. And here we are, more than 15 years later, still finding new threads inside it worth pulling on, still finding new rooms in this world worth sitting quietly in the dark to visit one more time. If tonight's video kept you company the way it was meant to, take a second before you drift off and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more of Ooh left to walk through together, a lot more of these quiet chains still waiting underneath the surface for someone patient enough to follow them all the way down. Thank you for staying with me this deep into the night. Rest well. The land of Ooh will still be here tomorrow, still quickly becoming whatever it's going to become next.